The Rashba took a very interesting position about the eternal nature of mitzvos, arguing that even in the era of techiyas hameism, none of them could be suspended. However, a faction of his rabbinic colleagues disagreed with him over this issue. In this class, we examine the sources that were central to this discussion and also analyze the underlying dynamics, namely the attempt at the time of Christian missionaries to undermine Yiddishkeit. Let us see how the Rashba and his colleagues dealt with this problem. In the year 1263, there was a famous event that occurred in Barcelona in the Kingdom of Aragon, today in Spain, where there was a disputation between the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, and a representative from the Christian faith, and they debated various issues relating to the differences between Yiddishkeit and Christianity. Last summer we did a shiur on this topic, you may recall, related to the issue of was Mashiach born on Tisha B'Av, and most of that class revolved around this specific disputation. After the disputation, the Ramban wrote down an account of what happened. And it's normal to wonder, what was chapter 2? Every story is chapter 1, there's always a chapter 2, and that is the aftermath. And the emes is that the Ramban would not have really been privy to what happened in the aftermath of his debate, and that's because soon thereafter he was expelled from the Kingdom of Aragon and went to Eretz Yisrael. The reason he was expelled was because he did not have permission to write down or disseminate a record of this disputation. We discussed this again in the shiur last summer. What I want to do tonight is to look at what was the chapter 2. And there definitely was a chapter, there definitely was a hemshich, there definitely was a continuation. And today's shiur will be a small window into what that continuation would have looked like. So we're going to begin by learning a passage of Midrash. This comes from Midrash Mishlei, which is a collection of Midrash that's based on the Sefer of Mishlei. And this passage of this Midrash is rather famous. It's also brought in other collections of Midrashim, such as Yalkut Shemaini, but we're going to quote it from the Midrash Mishlei, which seems to be its original source. The Midrash is stelling on the pasuk in Mishlei Perek Tes, Af Archa Shulchana, which means she set up her table. Now what the pasuk means in its original context doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that the drash of this Midrash is that this is going on Esther HaMalka. That Esther HaMalka, she set up her table. What does it mean that Esther HaMalka set up her table? Says the Midrash, she set up a table both in this world and in the future world. What does that mean? What does it mean she set up her table? Ve'eza, what are we referring to? Says the Midrash, Zeh Shem Tov, shekansala ba'olam hazeh u'va'olam haba. It's the good name, it's her reputation, it's her fame that she got both in Olam Hazeh and in Olam Haba. Now the Midrash says, what does it mean that she's going to have her reputation and her fame in Olam Haba? So the Midrash continues and says, Shakol hamoya dimasidim betelim, because all of the Yom Tovim are eventually going to be nullified. Vimei hapurim, however, the Yom Tov of Purim, which is about Esther, einam betelim la'olam, they're never going to be nullified. How do I know it's never going to be nullified? Shenemar, because we have a pasuk in Megillas Esther that says as follows: Vimei hapurim ha'ela lo yavru mitoich haYehudim. The days of Purim will never be removed from the Jewish people, and so therefore Esther set up her table, meaning through her deeds and the story of Purim, she gained for herself fame and a positive reputation, not only ba'olam hazeh in her day and in our day, but also ba'olam haba. The chiddush of the olam haba part is because many of the other heroes who are celebrated in the other Yom Tovim lav davka. If you come to Moshe Rabbeinu about Pesach, we're hearing here there isn't going to be the positive reputation for Moshe Rabbeinu. It sounds like here la'olam haba, because la'olam haba there is not going to be a celebration of Pesach, and likewise you can have a similar discussion for other Yom Tovim, specifically Esther, who acquired for herself a reputation also la'olam haba. This is what the nameless memra of the Midrash says. Amar Rabbi Lazar. Then Rabbi Lazar comes along and he says, I'd like to add something. What does he add? Af Yom HaKippurim einoi batal la'olam. Yom Kippur also is never going to be nullified. The other one's no problem. But in addition to Purim, also Yom HaKippurim. It's known that the name sounds similar, right? It's been noted in other contexts. Yom HaKippurim is never going to be batal la'olam. Why? I have a pasuk. What's the pasuk? We say, this is going to be an everlasting statute, where the Jews are going to be forgiven, atoned for once a year. And notice the pasuk says it will be for you a chukas olam. What's a chukas olam? Everlasting. Everlasting means you can't say that it's going to be nullified. And this is a pasuk he quotes in Parshas Acharei Mos. The MS is that we have a similar pasuk in this week's parsha. This week's parsha we have a parsha of the Yomim Tovim. And we go through all the Yomim Tovim, all the biblical Yomim Tovim. And over there, when it comes to Yom Kippur, we taka say that Yom Kippur is going to be a chukas olam. Ad kan the Midrash. Now, the Rashba was a Talmud of the Ramban. And the Rashba was, so to speak, the Jewish leader. After the Ramban left, the Rashba took the mantle of being the leader of the Jewish people in this area of Spain. And in fact, as there are many different areas in Jewish life where he was very important, and he wrote many tshuvas, many questions that came into him, and he wrote different answers. And this set of tshuvas is very popular. In fact, it's one of the first Jewish books to be printed. The first dated Jewish book to be printed was printed in 1475. That has a date on it. It has a colophon. You can read it. We know the date. However, it is known that there were svarim that were printed beforehand in Rome, a few years earlier, around 1470. And the tshuvas of the Rashba are one of this collection of 8, 9 svarim, I don't remember, that were printed in Rome. They just don't have an exact date, so we don't know what's first, what's second, what's third. But this is the first collection of svarim. It shows how popular the tshuvas of the Rashba were. And someone asked the Rashba, Shaila, what's pshat in this medrash? Hayatochin that you have this medrash? What's the problem? The problem is, the person writing the question says, isn't it the case that Judaism, the halachas of Torah, are everlasting, they're forever? So how could you have a medrash that says quite explicitly that all the Yomim Tovim, except for 1 or 2, are going to be nizbatal? Sha'alta, and the Rashba responds, you asked, Masha Amru b'medrash sefer Mishlei, you asked about this medrash on Mishlei, and he quoted the medrash, and the lashon of the question is, who has the audacity to say that even one word, one letter from the Torah is going to be nullified? Even the smallest crown, the tip of the letter of the Yud can't be nullified. How can we say about Yomim Tovim that they're going to disappear? Well, the Rashba agreed with the questioner. The Rashba agrees, as we're going to see, that it is impossible to take this medrash literally. Tshuva, dvarim noisafim oid ba'agadazu. In order to establish his point, he says, I want to point out additional interesting things about this medrash. And here he quotes the shita that we have it in our version of the medrash Mishlei, it's Rabbi Lazar. In the Rashba's version, for whatever reason, it was Rabbi Yoda Nasi, who suggests that in addition to Purim, it's also Yom Kippur. Frek the Rashba, why? Because by Yom Kippur it says Chukas Oila. Frek the Rashba, 1 second, and go to Pesach. Look at Parshas Boy when it talks about Pesach. What does it say? V'hoya hayoim azel lachem lezikaron Chukas Oilam tuchagu. It says clearly in Parshas Boy that the Pesach is going to be a Chukas Oilam forever. So if that's good enough for Rebbe or Rebbe Lazar to turn Yom Kippur into an everlasting Yom Tov, so then why isn't it good enough for Pesach to turn it into an everlasting Yom Tov? And we may add that the Rashba doesn't do it. And if you look at the Parshas HaMoedes and Parshas Emer, you'll notice that by Shavuos there's a pasuk that says Chukas Olam L'Dorei Seichem, and by Sukkot in this week's Parsha also you see that message of L'Dorei Seichem. And so therefore, the Rashba is basically piling it on. You asked one question, I'm going to ask another question. What's the Rashba's intention? The Rashba's intention is to basically say, so therefore, because of these difficulties, we have to reinterpret this medrash, which he proceeds to do. Okay, nirali pirusha. So therefore, this is what I think its meaning is. Shakol hamoyadim lo yiftiach aleim yisparech shelo yigroi machet bitulam be'echad min hazmanim. What he's saying over here is, you're misunderstanding what this Medrash is saying. It's not telling you, do you need to keep it forever? You don't need to keep it forever. Will it be obligatory forever? No. That's not what's under discussion here. What's under discussion here is it's a promise from Hashem, a special promise about Purim. What's the special promise about Purim? Hashem, and he only said this about Purim, and he never said this about any other Yom Tov. Hashem is looking the Jewish people in the eye, and he's saying, by the way, you should know, there's never going to come a time in history that because of persecution, you're not going to be able to observe this holiday. That's all it means. Whereas for the other Yom Tovim, we never received that assurance. And then he goes on to quote a pasuk from Eicha. The pasuk in Eicha Perek Beis says as follows: Shikach Hashem b'tzion moyed v'Shabbos. Here, the lamentation is basically trying to say that because of the Churban, because of the destruction that happened in Eretz Yisrael, so there's no more Moyed, there's no more Moyed, and there's no more Shabbos, there's no more Yom Tov in Eretz Yisrael. So that's an example of where due to persecution, a Yom Tov and a Shabbos fell away. And that happened to Rosh Hashanah, and it happened to Sukkot, and it happened to Pesach, and it happened to all the Yom Tovim. Even Yom Kippur, you'll see. It happened to all the Yom Tovim. Purim, it's not going to happen to. Vas Epis, why Dafke Purim? It's not going to happen to. He doesn't discuss it. He doesn't say, so we're not going to get into it. Asum haftacha lo yasara. It's not about telling you what Jewish law is. It's just a unique promise that's appended to Purim. What about Yom Kippur? Another view adds Yom Kippur. So the Rashba you maybe could have said the same thing. That God promises that Yom Kippur will never take it away. But he doesn't say that. He doesn't say that. It could be he doesn't say that because it's not the first view says it only about Purim. So that should be a standalone view. The idea of that there's this promise forever, that's Purim. Yom Kippur is a new man d'amar, it's a new person. So therefore, it should be a new understanding, a different perspective. And what does he say? He says, he interprets it as follows. V'chein Yom Kippurim. What does the pasuk mean? It's haftacha shetia lechukas olam. It's a promise. It's similar, but it's different. It's a promise that is going to be everlasting. In what sense? Sha'ayom yechaper v'afilu lo yishmeruhu. The day will serve as an atonement forever, irrespective of whether you're observing it or not. In other words, Pesach. If you want Pesach to mean something for a Jew, he observes it. It means something. He doesn't observe it. It doesn't mean anything for him. It doesn't do anything for you if you don't observe it. That's the average Yom Tov. Yom Kippur is unique, where we're told that even if you do nothing, it still has an impact on you, and in that way, it's everlasting in a way than more so than all the other Yom Tov. Kol hamoyadim, all the Yom Tov asidim betelim, they could be bottled in the sense that it has no impact on you if you fail to observe it. But Yom Kippur, even if you fail to observe it, it's going to have an impact on you. This is how he teaches. And this, he goes on to say, is consistent with the view of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. Remember, the Rashba has the Yom Kippur viewpoint linked with Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, not with Rabbi Lazar. We have a machlokes in the Gemara in Shavuos about Yom Kippur. Is it Itzuma Shal Yom Mechaper? Does the day itself atone irrespective of what Jews do? Or no, is it contingent on behavior? Chachamim say, Lashavim, you have to do tshuva. Yom Kippur is Mechaper Lashavim. In other words, if you don't tap into what Yom Kippur is, it's going to be meaningless for you. Papashtos, on the simplest level. Rebbe is the one who says that even if you don't observe it, it's going to have an impact. So it works out perfect. That's what's happening here in this particular medrash. And he concludes, the Rashba does, when it says chukas olam by Pesach, that's azhara. That means forever keep it. And likewise by Sukkot, and likewise by Shavuos, in our parsha, when it says chukas olam, that's telling you what to do and not to do. But Purim and Yom Kippur, the chukas olam element is not about a command of a duration of how long this obligation is in effect. For Purim, it's about there will never be persecution that gets Jews to stop observing this, whereas for other ones it will happen, as we see in Eicha. For Yom Kippur, even without observing it, and only for Yom Kippur, even without observing it, it's going to mean something. It's going to have an impact on the Jewish soul, and this is how he explains what this medrash means. Now, I hope you realize that, sometimes we read a piece of rabbinic commentary, and it sounds a little bit like a doichik. And what does a doichik mean? Many questions come up in our head. Many questions. And this is exactly what happens over here. Because throughout the ages, when people looked at this interpretation of the Rashba, many people asked many questions, and I'm sure if you put your time and wrote down your question, you come up with many different questions on the Rashba's interpretation of this medrash. We're going to look at two questions that were asked by prominent Rabbanim in the 1500s. The first is the Maharal. And the Maharal says as follows: did we forget about the context over here? Let's remember, there was a pasuk in Mishlei, and the Mishlei said Esther gained a reputation. Ba'olam hazeh uva'olam haba. What's an olam haba? Because all the Yom Tovim are not going to be an olam haba, and Purim is going to be an olam haba. Good. So the whole nakuda of this medrash is to say that all the Yom Tovim are not going to be in this era that's called olam haba, and that Purim will be. But the Rashba told us that's not what it means. The Rashba says it has nothing to do with olam haba. The Rashba is saying that la'asad lavoi in olam haba, all Yom Tovim are equal in terms of their observance. So this is not fair. He says you stripped it of its original context. This is the Maharal's problem in his Sefer Tiferes Yisrael. Then we have the Manas Halevi. The Manas Halevi is Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabitz. He's known as the author of Licho Doidi, but he also wrote a Sefer, the Manas Halevi. It's a full Sefer on Megillah Esther. I don't remember. I think it's the first Sefer on the Megillah. I think the person who wrote a full-fledged Sefer, a full volume, a huge commentary, and there are many things that we only have, interpretations that he quotes that otherwise we wouldn't have. Anyway, he writes in Hakdama that this is a Mishleach Manas that he's sending to his Shver because he doesn't have a fancy Mishleach Manas to prepare. We spoke about him once in a previous class. So the Shlomo Halevi Alkabitz says, I don't understand this Rashba. He says, V'daiti ksara alai b'dvarav. I don't understand what he means. I don't get it. Aleph, number one, his whole thesis is difficult. Why? Experience has shown that these Yom Tovim have been isbatel due to persecution just like these. In other words, what he's saying is, remember his time, right? He's writing 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, I don't know exactly his dates, but it's the mid-16th century he's writing. And there's what happened in Spain, there's what happened in Portugal. The Jews there were able to observe Purim, Jews over there weren't observing Purim. So the idea that Pesach was taken away from a community and there was a community who wasn't able to observe it, and not Purim, he feels that historically it's inaccurate. He says experience has shown that whatever happened to the other Yom Tovim has happened to Purim too, and so therefore he feels like he has to reject the Rashba's answer. And then he goes on to ask another question. He says, the Rashba made a big deal out of the fact that it's the Shita of Rebbe, and Rebbe holds Yom Kippur because Rebbe's Shita is that Yom Kippur is Mechaper even if you don't do Tshuva, and so he's the one who says, Chukas Olam, because it means even if a Yid doesn't do Tshuva, the Moyed isn't going to be bottled from that Yid. Okay, our Girsa doesn't have Rebbe, it has Rabbi Lazar, and we're going to start saying that Rabbi Lazar links up with Rebbe. That's not such a simple thing to do. That's not such a simple thing to do at all. And even if you want to say that our Girsa is wrong, and that his Girsa is right, and maybe it should say Rebbe, he says, I still don't understand. At the end of the day, the Psukim are very similar. Read the Pasuk by Yom Kippur. What does it say by Yom Kippur? It says, it should be for you, Chukas Olam. What does it say by Pesach in Parshas Boy? That is extremely similar. Extremely similar. So how are we coming along saying that this pasuk over here, which is almost the same words, this one is a command for the duration, Pesach command duration forever, and this one is not a command about the duration, it's telling you that whether it's going to have an effect on your neshama, whether you observe it or not. He feels that this is a difficulty. So these are three questions that were asked by these Gdolei Yisrael, the Maharal and the Manas Halevi. Again, both of them writing in the 16th century on the Tshuva of the Rashba. Now, before we address these questions, let's look at another scene that is very, very similar to what we just experienced. We'll start with a Chazal, look how the Rashba interprets this Chazal, and then see the questions that pile up on Rashba's interpretation. The Gemara in Nida Daf Samach Aleph says as follows: Tanu Rabbanon, we learned in a Braisa, Beged she'ovad boy kilayim. You have a garment, the kilayim got lost in it. What does that mean? So let's say it's a garment of linen, and there was a thread of wool, and we know it's there, but we can't identify it. If you identify it, you can take it out. We don't know where it is anymore. So you can't wear it. You can't wear it now. So what do we do with it? So what do you do with this garment? So there's various uses. One of the things the Brisa says you can do is you're allowed to take this and turn it into shrouds, and you're allowed to bury a person who has passed away. You're allowed to bury him in this garment. The commentaries explain it's not only if there's one string, one small strip of kalayim, even if the whole thing is full of kalayim. And lechatchila, no problem. You're allowed to use kalayim for shrouds. Amar Rav Yosef, if says Rav Yosef, the Amir Rav Yosef says the following implication. Zayis HaMedes shows us that mitzvahs betela is lasid lavai. That the mitzvahs lasid lavai, the pashtus this means, in the era of olam haba, in the future, the mitzvahs are going to be bottled. What does he mean? So the basic commentators tell us, Tosfos says it, many others say it. What he means here is as follows. If you're burying a yid in Kilayim, and then there was one day going to be techiyas hameism, he wakes up, and guess what? He's wearing Kilayim. You're machshel him for a few centuries from now. How could you do such an act? The answer is no, because now there's no issue, right? And then it's also no issue. Now there's no issue because he isn't alive. Then when he returns to life with techiyas hameism, mitzvahs betelis lasalave. There's no mitzvahs anymore. There's no chiyuvim. There's no isser of kilayim anymore. There's no isser of shanis anymore. And so therefore, he says that, so we see from here that mitzvahs betelis lasalave. Good. Now the Rashba has a commentary on Maseches Nida. Chidushei Rashba. Let's see what the Rashba says. The Rashba says he has a very big problem with this understanding of the Gemara. What's his problem with this understanding of the Gemara? So he cites the story in Yecheskel of Atzamas HaYeveshes. You have the Nevuah in Yecheskel where the Navi is told to go to a valley and there's dry bones, and he prophesies, and then they all come together and they come back to life, and there's different machlokas in the Gemara. What does this mean? Is it something that happened in the past? Is it something that will happen in the future? Literal, metaphor, many different views about what's happening here. And in that discussion, there is an Amoira that says, hold on a second, why are you having this discussion if it happened? It didn't happen. In fact, it happened, and it's in the past and it happened. And the lashon of the Gemara is, one of the Amoraim says, Abba mehen, my own parents come from them. The elu tefillin sheiniach li abba mehem, and I got this tefillin from my father, comes from one of those people of the Meisei Midbar. Okay, Rashba thinks that this is a huge problem for our Gemara. Mitzvahs betelis lasid lavai, and this is a huge problem. Now the truth is, you're going to have to struggle to understand why this is a problem, because on the face of it, mitzvahs betelis lasid lavai is talking about something that's far off in the future, hopefully not far off in the future, but something in the future in a world that's very different from ours. And he's asking a shaila about an event that happened in the past. What is even his question? Well, his question is, what does mitzvahs betelis lasid lavai mean? He's choosing to understand it is that once a person passes away and then comes back to life, there's no more mitzvahs anymore. That's how we understand mitzvahs betelis lasid lavai. When a person passes away and comes back to life, so then in round 2, there's no more mitzvahs. And that's lasid lavai, so there's no more mitzvahs anymore. That, he says, doesn't make sense when you consider this Gemara. Because here you have someone who says, my father had passed away, he was brought back to life, and I have his tefillin. In other words, he was keeping the mitzvah of tefillin after he came back to life. Why was he keeping the mitzvah of tefillin after he came back to life? Presumably, he wasn't volunteering. Presumably, it was an obligation. So here I see that even after a person experiences techiyas hameism, there is a chiyuv to do mitzvahs. So how could I say that after the collective techiyas hameism, there's going to be no mitzvahs? And the Rashba feels this is a huge, huge question. And because of this question, the Rashba says, V'nirali, I am going to offer a new interpretation of what this Gemara means. It's not what you think it means. Mitzvahs betelis lasid lavai does not mean that in the era of olam haba, in the era of schar, in the era of techiyas hameism, there's no mitzvahs. That's not what it means. What does it mean? What does it mean? Misha shemeis ka'amar. It means la'asid lavai means mitzvahs betelis la'asid lavai. A person is exempt from mitzvahs in the hereafter, meaning once they pass away, when a person's body is lowered into the grave, which is la'asid lavai, right? We're alive today, so it's not in the future. When people pass away, that element, that interpretation of future, there is no mitzvahs that is relevant to them. Now, we see that's very obvious. So he says, I'll explain what the chiddush of the Gemara is. We know when it comes to children that there is no obligation min ha-Torah. If you see a child eating non-kosher food, there is no chiyuv min ha-Torah to stop the child from eating non-kosher food. But afal b'kein, the Gemara says in Yevamis that when the Torah says loy soichlum, that you shouldn't eat shkatzim, it's talking about creepy things, that you shouldn't eat it. The Chazal darshan that word loy soichlum means loy ta'achilum. Don't feed them. Don't feed them to children. See, even if you don't need to make a macha for the child eating the non-kosher, you're not allowed to actively feed a child non-kosher. And the lashon is connected to this week's parsha. Lahazir gdoilem alaktanim. The older people have a chiyuv to ensure that the children don't do it, at least in the sense that the older people, the adults, are not allowed to actively be involved in helping the child do the avera. So a person could have said and say, hold on. Maybe, yeah, that person who's passed away doesn't have a chiyuv, but I'm the one who's burying him. And so just like I can't give non-kosher to a child who doesn't have a chiyuv, I can't give non-kosher to a dead body. Now, what does that mean? I can't dress him in non-kosher clothes. So there would be a havamina. Therefore, comes the Gemara and says, Amar of Yosef, Zoysa merit mitzvos beteles l'asid lavoi. In the future, after a person passes away, mitzvos beteles, and there's no issue, even you can dress the deceased in shrouds that are made of kilayim. L'asid lavoi doesn't sound like that. L'asid lavoi to me sounds like you're talking about Mashiach Tzaitin. Sounds like you're talking about techiyas hameism. Says the Rashba, no, I'll bring you rayas from Chazal that they use the word la'asid lavoi in two ways. Sometimes Chazal use the term la'asid lavoi to refer to the times of Mashiach and to the times of techiyas hameism. Sometimes la'asid lavoi just meant in the future. And he brings a few examples. One of the examples is from a Gemara in Yuma. The Gemara in Yuma has the following discussion. Rav Yosef was matir on Yom Kippur. He gave a lecture, and he was matir people to come and walk to his lecture, even though it meant that they had to walk through a river to get to him. And that's you're not allowed to do rechitza on Yom Kippur. Okay, fine. If you know the dinim of a rechitza and the specifics, it's okay. You're allowed to. You don't intend to do rechitza. It's okay. You're allowed. So he let them come. But however, when it came time to go home, he said no one's allowed to go home, because then you're going to be walking through. On the way here, you had the justification of Shir Torah. You don't have that justification now, so you can't. You can't go back in the water on Yom Kippur. So Abaya said, Im Kain, or whatever, Shaloi Sehei Machshil L'Asid Lavoi. You're being machshil them L'Asid Lavoi, meaning next year. L'Asid Lavoi simply meant next year. Next year, no one's coming to your Shir, because they know they can come, but they can't go back. Right? That's what also says. If a Maggid Shir ends his Shir late, it's the same thing. Shaloi Sehei Machshil L'Asid Lavoi. People aren't going to come back if you end your Shir a little late. Okay. So, what does the Rashba show you? That la'asid lavoi doesn't mean, what does la'asid lavoi there mean? It means next year. So la'asid lavoi can mean in the near future. And this is the Rashba's interpretation. And so, it makes so much sense to obviously tie these two pieces together. We have a Midrash that sounds like it's saying there's no Yomim Tovim besides for one or two when Mashiach comes or in the era of techiyas hameism. Rashba says, no, wrong understanding. We have a Talmudic statement which makes it sound like there is no mitzvahs, la'asid lavoi, and the Rashba comes and says, no, that's the wrong understanding. It's just saying that when a person is dead, they have no mitzvahs. But in fact, when a person is, when people are going to wake up for techiyas hameism, there is going to be mitzvahs. And in fact, he leaves us here with a question that's unanswered. And that is, so Ibazoi, why is it taka mutter to bury someone in with shatnez when they wake up in techiyas hameism? With techiyas hameism, they're going to be over and isser. Okay, and according to you, mitzvahs aren't betelos. So what makes you allowed to do it? So in his commentary to the Gemara, he actually did not address this question. We're going to hold that later. We're going to see eventually he did. What's interesting about this la'asid lavoi thing is that, the Rebbe would give very brief responses to certain types of reports that were given to him. One of the nuschos that the Rebbe would use very often is kein yervaser toiv la'asid lavoi. And if you speak to people that got these answers, ask them how they understood this answer. Some will tell you they understood the Rebbe is saying, you should in the future continue to convey Psuras Toivos. Some people understood it more in the sense of la'asid lavoi, Mashiach Tzaitin. So you see it's a similar type of discussion that's happening here in the Rashba. Now, last time I showed you, after the Rashba introduced his innovative interpretation on the Midrash, what happened? I showed you two very powerful questions from the Maharal and from the Manas HaLevi. Let's do something very similar now. We'll introduce 2 or 3 very powerful questions from the Ritva. The Ritva learned by the Rashba. The Rashba is Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderes. The Ritva is Rabbi Yomtiv ben Avram. The Ritva is a little younger. And the Ritva learned by the Rashba. It wasn't his Rebbe. His main Rebbe, the Ritva's main Rebbe, we'll see later who he was. But he learned by the Rashba. And the Ritva wrote his own commentary. And he took major objection. He objected to Rashba's interpretation over here. First, he brings, remember, what got Rashba started into this whole direction? What got Rashba started in this whole direction is the big shaila about the masim and Yecheskel, the dry bones, and you see, the guy woke up and still he had to keep tefillin. So there's a raya that in the era of techiyas hameism, we're still going to have to keep tefillin. The Ritva says, I'm very unimpressed with this proof or with this type of question. Because he says as follows,
Haloi kasha. This is not a shayla b'chlal. Shalai amru mitzvos betelos min hameism. No one ever suggested that mitzvahs are bottled from someone who passed away. That's not the discussion. Of course, if someone passes away and then miraculously comes back to life today, right now, they have to observe mitzvahs. There's no shayla about that. What we say is mitzvos betelos el techiyas hameism asid lava. It means in this new era that's so different from today. Sheyei seif hakoil, in the end of time. That's where Karina behayoim la'asaisam u'lamachal lekabel schar. And this is a passage from the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where there's this era that's called lamachar lekabel scharan, and there it's not about activity. Today is about activity. Today is about kiyum mitzvahs, and there's this eventual time that's not going to be about kiyum hamitzvahs. Techiyas hameism of Yecheskel, that was only b'mixas. A few people had a techiyas hameism. So of course, loy batlu Torah mitzvahs. Sharei loy hoya lehem techiyas hameism gemura lekabel schar. No one thinks they went into the era of techiyas hameism. No one thinks they moved out of the era of hayoim la'asoisam and to the era of schar. In fact, he says, hoilidu banim, they had children. V'gam chazru la'afram, they passed away. For the Ritva, this is signs that you didn't reach the real techiyas hameism, because in the real techiyas hameism for him, there is no procreation. That's an interesting comment that he makes. And there shouldn't be where the person passes away. And so therefore the Ritva says, he's very unimpressed with this question of the Rashba using the story of the Atzamas HaYeveshos to kind of force a reinterpretation of mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava. Then the Ritva goes on. And he quotes the Shita of the Rashba, and he summarizes it as saying, Zu Shitas Harav Zal. This is the Shita of the Rashba. And he writes, V'kama hikshesi lefanov. It's a very interesting lashon. I struggled with him. I spoke to him, it sounds like face to face, where I disagreed with the Rashba, and I argued with him. I'm like, no, you're giving us the wrong pshat. Why? Chada. First of all, the Lishna, the mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava. When you say the language mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava, ein b'mashma loymar she'ein anu musar al hameism. Again, what's Rashba's theory here? Rashba's theory is mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava is that as people go into the grave, there's no mitzvahs pertaining to them. Seriously, that's how you say it. Then you say ein mitzvahs l'meisim, ein chiyuv mitzvahs l'meisim. You can tell me mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava. I'm sorry, it just doesn't sound right. V'oidi says, I didn't show this before. But in the Gemara, there's a machloikas. Rav Yosef said, mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava. There's another amoyer of Yanai, says he disagrees. Rav Yanai says that you're not allowed to bury a person with shatnez. Now, in the traditional understanding, what does that mean? Very simple. One view says, mitzvahs betelos l'aseh lava, so therefore you could bury someone with shatnez. That's Rav Yosef. Rav Yanai says, no, you're not allowed to bury someone with shatnez, because there's going to be mitzvahs l'aseh lava. So that makes a lot of sense. According to the Rashba, what's the two sides? One view says you can't put the person in the ground with shatnez. You are allowed to, because mitzvahs betelos is from dead people. And what's Rabbi Yanai hold? That the shmiras ha-mitzvahs are dead people? Is this really a normal svara? So Rav Yanai doesn't make any sense anymore. If you say we're talking about the future, so you can say there's a valid debate. Is there mitzvahs in the era of techiyas hameism or not? There can't be a reasonable debate about whether when we bury people on the ground, they have a chiyuv of mitzvahs now, or whether we're obligated to ensure that they're keeping mitzvahs. Children, what do you mean? But we see by children, they don't have a chiyuv, and we're not allowed to actively lead them to an avera. You're going to compare that children to dead people, he says. Children are children, and they're going to grow up, and they're going to live a full life, the shmiras Torah mitzvah. So it makes sense to say that although they don't have a chiyuv, you're not allowed to go and actively lead them to do an avera. That makes sense. But for someone who finished his mission here on earth, to start saying that we still have a thing to keep that it's done in a way of Torah mitzvahs, the burial, obviously the burial has to be done in a Torah mitzvah, but the idea that they have to observe one of the 613 and that's still on us, the Ritva is very unimpressed with this type of argument. So just like, we'll do the questions at the end. We'll do the question at the end. So just like we had with the Medrash and Mishlei, we had Rashba's innovative interpretation. We have the same thing here in the Gemara. The common denominator is, if you ask the Rashba, is there a time, ever, any time, and ever a time where there is no mitzvahs in this physical world? The Rashba's answer is no. There is no time. There cannot be such a time. Okay. Now, when we have an interpretation like this, it behooves us to dig a little deeper and to try to see, is there more that's going on behind the scenes? And it does seem that there's much more that's going on behind the scenes. In 1863, There was a Jew by the name of Yosef Perls or Perlis, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his name. And he produced a book in German on the Rashba. Full book, a biography on the Rashba. And he also printed in the back of the book interesting letters from the Rashba that had never been printed before. I told you before that the Shuvas of the Rashba were printed already in 1470 on Erech in Rome. But there was many things from the Rashba writings that weren't printed. And he found some interesting letters, and he printed them in the back of this volume in 1863. And one of these letters is a lengthy letter called Pirush Agadas LaRashba, meaning the manuscript read Pirush Agadas LaRashba, Rashba's interpretation to the Agadah sections of the Torah. And he published it at the back of his book in 1863. Now it's a good thing he did, because there was only one manuscript of this mimer, you want to say, or this essay from the Rashba. There was only one manuscript, and it was in a Jewish institution in Breslau, the rabbinical seminary. And during World War II, that library was looted, and so this manuscript is gone. And so the only information we have about this manuscript is through Perlis's book in 1863. There's another very similar thing is the Pirush of the Rashbam ala Torah. There's only one manuscript that had Pirush Rashbam. What we have printed from the Rashbam is based almost all on one manuscript. This one manuscript was also in this place in Breslau, in the rabbinical seminary, and again, it also disappeared during World War II. No one really knows what happened to it, if it even exists today. What's unique about this Pirush Agadas to the Rashba is that he's contending with a disputation with Christianity. In fact, he writes a lashon. We're not going to quote from it, but I want you to know. He writes a lashon a few paragraphs before where we're going to pick it up from. Ve'echad min chachmei hanoitzrim heshivani. One of the wise Christians responded to me. In other words, he's attesting to the fact that the Rashba had a face-to-face encounter and a debate with a Christian scholar. And you'll see as we read through this text that he's going to be talking about the fact that they say this, and this is what we respond. They say this, and this is what we respond. So let's have a little bit of a look at what we have over here. Umi shekenegdenu, and those who oppose us. We'll talk a little more about who he's maybe referring to in a second. Toyenu v'aleinu, so they come with tainus and they say, mitzad ha'agadah shabo b'talmud, using the agadata, using the non-legal sections of the Gemara, and they want to make arguments to support their cause. I opened the shir by talking about the Ramban. We spoke about the debate in 1263. One of the unique things about this debate in 1263 is for the first few good few centuries of Christianity, when they argued with Jews, and there was always argument with Jews from day one, the book that they pulled out was always a Tanakh. And they said, this is the Pshat in Tehillim, Perek Beis, this is the Pshat in Yeshaya, Perek Nun Gimel, etc., etc., etc. The shift that happened, and as far as people can tell, it happened during this century, during the 13th century. There's a new tactic. The tactic was, if you study Chazal and Gemaras good enough, you'll see that we're right. This is the argument that was being put forth. And one of the places where it's more ripe for these types of things is Agadata. Because Agadata lechatchila is given in a way where it's vague, and therefore open to more twisting and interpretation. And so this is what you had. And that's at the Ramban's debate, the issues that they discussed were mostly where Friar Paul was going to passages from the Agadata and Midrashim and saying, this proves that Mashiach already came, if you remember, and things like that. And the continuation of that is happening here. In Ramban's debate and what Ramban wrote, that the main issue there was, did Mashiach come yet or not? They also discussed the issue of original sin, and they discussed Achdus Hashem. But there was a big issue that is just as significant as any other when Jews and Christians are living with each other, and that is Torah and mitzvos still operative? Do we have to observe the law? And that didn't come up in Ramban's debate, and Ramban is going to tackle it, the Rashba is going to tackle it over here. And what he's saying is that just like in Barcelona at the disputation, they invoked Agadata in order to justify their claims about Mashiach or whatever it is. They're doing the same thing now. They're going to invoke Agadata to say that Jewish law is no longer binding, and he's now going to have to contend with it. Now, when you're thinking about this, you may wonder, can you really make an honest academic argument that's persuasive and that is full proof for this type of claim, that if you learn Agadata, you can make an argument that the Christian claim is right, that we don't have to observe Torah and mitzvos anymore?
So the answer is no, that wasn't the goal, that wasn't the attempt. Think about debates that happen in the political scene today, right? This is not about getting the truth out there, and it's not about having an honest, robust discussion that's foolproof and like you come out with the truth. The idea is about scoring points. It's about dropping a good line that rings with the audience, and it leaves an impression with people. And we have to remember the context of the time. There was many reasons, chas v'shalom, for a Jew to walk over to the other side. First of all, it's a majority culture, minority culture, and that's a majority culture. Today, majority culture is more secular, but then the majority culture was Christian. And it's very normal for someone living in a majority culture to join the majority. That's how Hashem created human beings. We're very influenced by the majority culture, and there's a tendency to join. Alachas kan v'kama, when you add the fact that there was persecution and limitations on what Jews were able to do in terms of what occupations they could hold, etc., etc., etc. So all you needed from their perspective was a little bit of an excuse, for a Jew to have a little bit of an excuse where he shvach sich up a little in Amunah, and then he's willing to cross the other side. So this is not about presenting a full debate and we're mamish convinced him al piseichel. This is about scoring points, and you get a few people who anyway are on the fence because life is difficult and anyway assimilation is a thing, and then this may be the thing. You planted a little doubt in someone and you said one little thing. And what's that one little thing? Your rabbis keep on telling you that the law is forever, and that we're wrong because we say the law is not forever. Well, guess what? We're going to show you that there's a God that say the law isn't everlasting. And this is, the Rashba is now going to quote the Gemaras that they're citing in this regard. So the first Gemara relevant for our purposes here is the Gemara in Brachas Daf Yud Beis. And this is a discussion between Ben Zoyma and the Chachamim about Haskaras Yetzias Mitzrayim in the Yemois HaMoshiach, where Ben Zoyma says there's not going to be Haskaras. When Mashiach comes, there's no more mention of the mitzvah of Skiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. You have to remember that's one of the Tayag mitzvahs, and Ben Chachamim think there will be. The Chachamim Oimrim Kol Yamei Chayacha Lahavi L'Meis HaMashiach. But Ben Zoyma says that no, there's not going to be, and they cited Ben Zoyma, and they said, hold on, let's unpack this a little. If there's not going to be Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim, okay, there are other mitzvahs that are associated with Schiras Yetzias Mitzrayim. For example, Korban Pesach. For example, Chametz on Pesach. For example, Matzah. That's just 3. If they wanted, they could have gone with more. So if mentioning Mitzrayim is not going to be around when Mashiach comes, so then we might as well just suggest that it also means all those other mitzvahs. It's not just one. All those mitzvahs are gone. And so here you see that according to the Shitta Ben Zoyma, they say, the people arguing with me, the Rashba is talking, the people arguing with me say, you see over here that the law isn't going to be eternal. And this is one Gemara, this is one Gemara that they bring. Next paragraph. They want to strengthen their taina against us from the Gemara about the shrouds, lameis, and what Rabbi Yosef said, mitzvos betelas lasalove. It goes without saying, here you have a clear Gemara that says there's going to be a day when when there's not going to be any mitzvahs. And then they brought another Gemara, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which we touched on earlier, where it says, Hayoim la'asoisam ulamachar lakabel scharan, that now we live in an era of when we're actually doing. There's going to be a time when we don't have to do any more Kabbalah Schar. And in fact, the Gemara over there says that God is talking about Sukkah, Lasid Lavai. So the Gemara asks, how could you talk about the mitzvah of Sukkah, Lasid Lavai? Lasid Lavai is a time of Ayan Lasaisam, it's a time of Lamachal Kabbalah Scharan. So here you have a third Gemara where it's pretty clear. Let's read the oisphere of the argument. V'daitoi loymar, he's talking about someone specific over here. V'daitoi loymar, so this person wants to say, Shazu raya, this is evidence. Shechachme Yisrael moidim, that the Jewish sages agree, Sha'amitzis einon nitzchiyos, fa'asidas li's batal. And they're going to be nullified. V'chiven shekain, once you agree with that big idea, yesh reshus labaladin lachlik v'loymar, so now someone could come and say, Sha'afilu bizman hazeh b'teilos. Once you agree that they have an end day, so now we can have a conversation. You say it as an end day in the future. I say it as an end day in the past. You see? So, and he goes further. There is no significant difference between us. It's all, right? We're really in the same boat. Our view is so different. Fellow Reb Yid, our view is so different. It's so offensive to you. Why is it so offensive to you? It's very similar to what you hold anyway. It's just a difference in time. It's not an eichostic difference, it's a kamastic difference. And this is how the Rashba summarizes the arguments that were happening at the time. Now,
He is talking about the fact that he's having conversations with someone. And he's talking about kindness that are happening and that he's actively a part of. Look at this other sheet over here. Here you have a book that was printed in the year 1687, long after the period that we're talking about. If you look at the right-hand side, there's a title page. So you want to look at the title page. And you see, with the title page, the top line, it says, Raymond Martini. That's the author's name. This author did not live in the 17th century. This author lived during the times of the Rashba. And he wrote a book around the year 1270. It just wasn't printed till a long time later. And here we're looking at the 1687 print in Leipzig. Under his name it says, Ordinis, I can't read exactly that word, but it means, in Latin, it says order of preachers. So in other words, this Martini was a Dominican friar, and his job was to be a preacher and an advocate for Christianity. The title of the book comes under, it's called Pugio Fidei. I think that's the right pronunciation, I may be a little off. It means dagger of faith. This is a dagger in faith matters, adversus, against, Moors, that's how they called Muslims at the time, Judeos, and Jews. That's the book. So we have a book written by Raimondi Martini in the year 1270, around the year 1270, and it is against Moors, against the Islamic faith, and against the Jewish faith. Now, if you look at the left-hand side of that very page, you're looking at page 777 of this book, you'll notice right away that it has a lot of Hebrew on the page. And indeed, in the manuscripts, not all of them, but some of them, from the 13th century onward, this book was authored not just with arguments against Judaism, but quotes and selections of quotes, both from Tanakh, as well as from rabbinic sources, and with the Hebrew, and then Latin translations, and then his arguments. And if you're looking at this page 777, you'll notice that the first Hebrew source there is a pasuk about Chukas Olam. And the next pasuk that is there is a pasuk of L'chak L'cha Uvanecha Ad Olam. And the next third pasuk on the same page is a pasuk about Chukas Olam L'Doirei Seichem. The next pasuk over there is about Tamid. Yarchenu Lifnei Hashem Tamid. Again, what is he dealing with here? You don't have to know Latin to be able to tell. He's dealing here with the question of the eternal nature of Jewish law. And he's quoting psukim. In other words, he's getting into this discussion and this argument right over here. On the bottom, you're able to see that he has a collection of sources of, like the concept of, we spoke about this in a previous week, of where it says, Va'avodoi la'olam, and Chazal tell us, la'olam doesn't necessarily mean la'olam. So he's familiar with those sources, and he brings them in here. In fact, the Sefer Ikrim, when he gets into this discussion about is the law eternal, also makes this, it says, the words chukas olam themselves, in and of themselves, don't mean anything. You need to have the Torah Shabbal Peh with us to be able to tell us what olam means in each case. But you're able to tell what argument is being made over here. And obviously where I'm going at is that in the very same era of the Rashba, and they also placed this man, I'm not an expert in this, but they placed this Martini man in Barcelona. So in the time and place of the Rashba, we have this discussion in a book that's written, obviously in that day it would have only circulated as a manuscript. If you turn the page, you'll see on the right-hand side, which is page 787, if you go down toward like the lower third of the page, you'll notice he brings the Maimer Chazal from Yeshua ben Levi, from Gemara and Avodah Zarah. Hayoim la'asoisam v'lo lamachar la'asoisam. He's quoting here the Gemara. The Rashba told us they're quoting this Gemara. Here he's quoting this Gemara. Hayoim la'asoisam v'lo lamachar la'asoisam. You see that clearly on the page. Go over to the left-hand side, which is page 781. Look at the big Hebrew text right in the middle of the page. Ben Zoyma Omer. Shaloi lahaski yitzias Mitzrayim la'asid la'alai. He's quoting here the Ben Zoyma. This was, again, the Rashba told us that they're using the Ben Zoyma text to say, look, the law isn't eternal. Likewise, if you look to the bottom of page 781, you see the same thing. He's quoting here the Gemara Ben Zoyma. So even without knowing what he says here in the Latin, I think we're able to figure out, at the very least, what we're able to see is there is an active conversation that is going on in the time and place when the Rashba is operating, discussing these very issues. And again, because of the Perlis book that we have one Ksav Yad of the Rashba, where we see the Rashba saying that these very same arguments are being raised. There are those who go a step further and want to make an argument based on different things and evidence that maybe the Rashba had a face-to-face meeting with this Martini or not.
Ich weiß nicht, I don't know. For me, it's not even necessary to go there. Either he did or he didn't. What we know is that in Barcelona at the time, this was an active conversation, and we see the two sides of it. You see the Christian side over here in this document, and you see the fact that the Rashba is dealing with it. So now, let's go to how the Rashba is going to address this issue. So what does the Rashba do? So, B'negeya Yitzias Mitzrayim, I'll summarize what the Rashba says. The Rashba says 2 points. First of all, he says, I oppose this idea that because there's not going to be Schiras, Yitzias, Mitzrayim, Las Lavai, therefore it means it's a bundle. No Pesach, no Chametz. He says, that's not true. What's his simplest raya? His simplest raya is, if someone doesn't eat matzah on Pesach, what's the oynish? The oynish is he violated an asay. If someone didn't bring the carbon Pesach, it's Isser Kares. So what do you mean? If it's one package, why would there be different types of oinshim? So you see, don't run away with this idea that it's a package deal. And so therefore, his first point is, even if you establish that there will be no mentioning, no obligation to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim, Lasalava, even if you cross that bridge, that's the only thing that's crossing that bridge, and you're not bringing any other mitzvah with it because he feels like he took away the bundle, and once and that took away the central part of the argument. He says, okay, but what about that one thing? What about that one thing? The mitzvah to mention Yitzias Mitzrayim. So you say, well, the Chachamim disagree. Okay, but there's another view. There's Ben Zayma. So he says, I'll tell you. I think this mitzvah is still going to be Lasad Lava, even L'Shitas Ben Zayma. It's just the method of observance is going to change. So here the Rashba does give a little ground. The method of observance is allowed to change, but the core of the mitzvah has to remain the same. What's the core of the mitzvah to remember Yitzias Mitzrayim? What's the purpose? What's the function of the mitzvah? She says the function of the mitzvah is that I should recognize and know that God is in control of everything that happens in this world. How do you remind yourself of that? When you remember the fact that Jews were enslaved in a very difficult place and no one thought they could ever get out, and Afal became they got out, that reminds you God is all powerful, and He can extract you from your difficult circumstance that you're in a given time, and it builds your bitachon. This is what the Rashba says is the core, is the soul of the mitzvah of mentioning Yitzias Mitzrayim. Okay. Says he that when it's going to come, Lasid Lavai, we're going to do the same thing. Just instead of talking about Yitzias Mitzrayim, you'll talk about Bias HaMashiach. You're going to say there was a nation of Jews. We were spread out in the four corners of the globe under very, very difficult circumstances. No one thought we would ever be able to have the Messianic era. And look, it happened anyway. And therefore that shows us that God intervenes in history and is relevant to our day-to-day lives. So instead of talking about Yitzias Mitzrayim, we're going to talk about Mashiach. Is that Bittul HaMitzvah? Someone could argue it's Bittul HaMitzvah. The Rashba thinks, I don't think that's Bittul HaMitzvah. It's the core of the mitzvah remains the same. It's just the method of observance is changing. This is how he addresses the Ben Zayma issue. How does he address the issue of mitzvahs betelas lasalava? You already know how he's going to address it, and he does so in this essay. He does it at length. He says lasalava is not talking about Mashiach Satan. It's not talking about techiyas hameism. It's talking about when we put the guy in the grave, that there is no obligation for him to do mitzvahs. That's the only thing it means. And he brings the children, just like you would think that there's an obligation to ensure that children, that you shouldn't be machshil children with an avera. So too you shouldn't be machshil someone who's deceased. And we say nishtazoi, and that's the only meaning of this text. And here is where he gives the answer we ask. So if this takan going to be mitzvah salaslavai, why are you allowed to bury a person with kalayim? What's going to happen when there's techiyas hameism? He's going to wake up. He's going to be wearing his kalayim. You are machshalim. What gives you a right to do it? So he said, hold on a second. Al pi teva, nothing lasts that long. Clothes are going to disintegrate. Yes, the Gemara says that there's going to be a special nace that the clothes are going to come back. Good. Techiyas hameism is a nace. Once we're at it, we add on another nace that the person is going to return in his original clothing. There is such a Gemara. Who's to say? And that nace is going to be that also the threads of shatness are going to come back. Why would God make a miracle like that? So therefore, you don't have to worry about it because all the threads are going to decompose in the earth. There's not going to be any shatness. And so therefore, there's not an issue. And this is where he addresses what I said before was a gap in the chidushim in Maseches Nida. What about the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, where it says, Machar is loyla asoisam, it's only lekabel schar? He says, that's talking about Gan Eden. That's talking about Olam HaNeshamas. That's talking about souls without bodies. That's not talking about down here in this physical world. This is his interpretation of that. And it's a very, very long essay. And he deals with a lot of issues, but just to give a small taste. And so, all of a sudden we realize
that what we opened with, just looked like commentary, regular rabbinic commentary on Maseches Nida, regular rabbinic commentary in a Shalos Teshuvos about a Medrash. All of a sudden we realize that yes, it is a rabbinic commentary, but the implications and the surrounding circumstances around that commentary, there's much more beneath the surface that needs to be taken into consideration. Now the Ritva I showed you before disagreed. He debated with the Rashba. He felt that the Rashba's shot was wrong. And here, let's continue reading the Ritva, and we'll see a new dimension for the disagreement between him and the Rashba. Look what the Ritva writes. If a heretic whispers to you, someone who follows the students of Yeshu, saying the following, because the Jews hold that mitzvahs are going to be batal asalavai, nimsa shaloi nitna Torah lazman. That proves that Torah isn't forever. And therefore, if the Torah isn't forever, so therefore we could come and add or detract. You should answer him. Only someone who himself has doubt would say such a thing. It's an interesting lashon. You're not comfortable in your position, and that's why you're saying that. Why? The Torah is forever. What do we mean by that? So long that our world exists the way it exists today, where you have schus and you have choiva, you have good and you have bad. As long as you have a battle between good and evil, the Torah is here to stay. When you move to a new world, there isn't two sides, there isn't a clash between holiness and unholiness. Then indeed there's not going to be Torah, there's not going to be mandates of mitzvahs, he says. And then look at this line. Vizu teshuva gemura. This is a complete answer to their claims. Now I'm going to read into, I may be wrong here, but I'm going to read into Vizu Teshuva Gemura. What's he saying? Rashba, you offered a very new interpretation to the Yom Tif text and to the text in Gemara Nida. Why? You offered that new interpretation not because it really deserves that interpretation. You offered that interpretation because you felt that you didn't need to have a very clear line that we say it's forever in this physical world. And you felt that without this new innovative interpretation, there is no tshuva gemura for the other side. I'm telling you, I disagree. What I'm saying is a tshuva gemura. My perspective is a tshuva gemura. We could say as long as the world exists the way it exists today, with the schus and chayiv, yetzah tov and yetzah hara, Torah mitzvahs is in full force. After that, we can have a conversation after that, but we're not holding that after that. And that's a tshuva gemura. So there's no need to twist ourselves in a pretzel. We could just take it kipshutai. And then he adds, V'chein das moiri hamuvak, Rabbeinu natre rachmana, my teacher, my Rav hamuvak. He learned by the Rashba. The Ritva learned by the Rashba. However, his Rav hamuvak was the Ra'ah, Rabbi Aaron Halevi, who lived at the same time. And so here we see that really there was, on the one hand, there was the Rashba. On the other hand, you had the Ra'ah and his very loyal Talmud, the Ritva, and there was a debate. And on one level, you could say that the debate was, how do you interpret these texts? How do you understand these divrei Agada? On another level, the debate is, how do we deal with the challenge that Yidden are facing today in our world? I think in this context, it's worth noting that the Ra'ah, the Rashba wrote a sefer called Teres Habayis, Halachis, Shchita, Nida, and other things. And the Ra'ah wrote a rejoinder to a number of the passages in that sefer. The Rashba sefer is called Teres Habayis, right, because relevant to a Jewish home. And the Ra'ah called it Bedek Habayis, like I'm coming to fix up the home because there's some issues that are over here. So here you see that in halachic matters, they weren't on the same page in every regard, and maybe when it came to the interpretation of Agoda, and maybe even when it came to how to deal with the challenge that Jews were facing at that time, maybe there was also a different perspective, and the Ritva clearly says, I'm going to go along with the view of my teacher, the Rav HaMuvak, the Ra'ah. Okay. The reality is, in summary, that both of these texts have been interpreted throughout our history in two ways. There have been those who've interpreted the text about the Yamim Tovim Kipshutai. La'asalavai, there's going to be Bittul Yamim Tovim, except for Yom Kippur and Purim. There have been those who said, no, it's a metaphor, or they interpret it in an interesting way, like the Rashba, or different from the Rashba. Likewise, when it comes to the text of mitzvahs b'teilus asalavai, there are those who interpret the Gemara like the Ra'ah, like the Ritva, in a literal way. However, there are those who say that no, more like the Rashba or following in his footsteps to say, no, there's not going to be a time of mitzvahs b'teilus l'asud lavai. And you could track it, but ultimately everyone pretty much fits into one of these two lines, into one of these two schools of interpretations for both of these texts. But we need to conclude with how does Chassidus, and specifically Chassidus Chabad, address some of these passages. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a sikha from the Rebbe in Tafshin Nun Beis on what is the meaning of mitzvahs b'teilus l'asud lavai. And I'll summarize what the Rebbe means here as follows. This is a sikha the Rebbe said in connection with the Siyam Rambam that happened then in the Tishrei of Tafshin Nun Beis. And it's a long essay on this whole discussion on this issue of mitzvahs b'teilus l'asud lavai. And the Rebbe learns as follows. The whole concept of saying that a mitzvah really becomes batal is highly problematic according to Chassidus. Why is that? A mitzvah is God's will, Ratzon Hashem. God's will and Him are inherently linked. Just like God doesn't change, and there's so much Jewish philosophical discussion on Ani Hashem Lo Shanisi, God doesn't change, God's Ratzon can't change, God's will cannot change. So the idea is that today I want this, but tomorrow I no longer want this. That's not possible. And so therefore a mitzvah, God wants no shatnez, that is a Ratzon that has to stay forever and ever and ever, and therefore there can never be an imagination, a theory, a suggestion that Ratzon changed. So then what's pshat? Mitzvahs b'teilus l'asud lavai. What does the word mitzvah mean? Mitzvah means a commandment. What does a commandment imply? A commandment implies that I have my own agenda. I want to do my thing. I have my own feelings and thoughts. You are outside of me, and you have a different agenda, and you have a different plan. And then you come and you say, listen here, I know that you want to do your own thing, but I'm commanding you to do it right. No one would say about their own body, so to speak, that they commanded themselves to breathe. Why do you say you commanded yourself to breathe? Because it happened. Your body is in sync with what you need for life, and so it happens automatically. Mitzvah means there's separation, and we overcome that separation by God commanding us. We don't want to, but we submit and we do Ratzon Hashem. L'asud lavai, we're going to be in a situation where we're fully in sync. When we're fully in sync, we know what Ratzon Hashem is. We know what Ratzon Hashem is, we do it automatically. Not because it's a struggle, we're fully in sync, we do it automatically. And here the Rebbe went further and said, in fact, not just we as humans will behave that way, all of nature will behave that way. And so therefore he revisited the question, what about shatnez? You're burying the guy with shatnez. What's going to be l'asud lavai when he wakes up? When he comes back to life, if you say the God's ratzon is always going to be in force, so what does it mean? How could he be waking up with his shatnez? What's the answer that Rebbe says? Just like the person is in sync, nature will also be in sync, which means that shatnez strand is going to disappear because it is also going to be fully in sync with what Ratzon Hashem is going to be. And this is the interpretation of what mitzvahs b'teilus l'asud lavai means. You could look more in the sikha. What about the Yomim Tovim? So Ebazai, how do you interpret? This means Ratzon Hashem is still there. So Ratzon Hashem for Pesach is still there. Ratzon Hashem for Shofar is still there. So what does it mean? Mitzvahs b'teilus what does it mean? Moyedin asidin libatel. So here Chassidus goes into the idea that every Yom Tif has a certain revelation of Elikus, a different level of Elikus. We're in tune with it, we're not in tune with it, we could be in tune with it, it's a separate discussion, but there's a separate revelation of Elikus. L'asud lavai, there's going to be such a big gilu, Yomala Aderes Deas Hashem, as the Navi says, such a big revelation of godliness that the specific revelations pertaining to specific Yom Tovim are going to be like a small candle in the presence of a huge flame where it's going to be meaningless. Today, it's like, oh, the Gilui L'kus of Pesach, big deal. Then it's going to be every day such a huge Gilui L'kus. What does Pesach really add? What does the Gilui L'kus of Pesach add? Not so much. Purim is so unique, and this is the Chiddush. Purim is so unique, the Gilui L'kus is going to be so special that even Legabe, the Gilui, the revelation, l'asud lavai is going to mean something. Yom Kippur, there's an argument for two ways. On one hand, you could say, no, it's going to be batal legabe the gilui of l'asud lavai. On the other hand, another argument can be made that it's going to be something of value l'asud lavai, and that's the debate. And obviously, this needs to be explained. And the Maimarim explain what this type of thing means. So, from this fascinating topic that I found fascinating, I think the strongest takeaway message is when you look at the end point, then it's supposed to influence the behavior today. If at the end point the goal is
for the nivra, for the creation, and for humans to be fully in sync with Hashem, that means that our job today is to try to find ways how we could become more in sync. How do we bridge this divide? How is it less of there's my agenda and his agenda, and it's a battle to figure out how I submit to him, but how could it become a little more? Obviously, fully it's not going to be possible, but how could it be a little more where we fall in sync? And I think the sources suggest that limud Torah is one of the key ways of doing that. When we immerse in Hashem's wisdom, slowly we inch our way toward where we want to be.